everybody. My name is Dr. Jerry Burkett, and I am an assistant professor here at Texas Women's University. And I'm sorry, I was looking forward to talking with everyone in the Leadership Literacy Policy class. We were scheduled for April 17th to have a live session, but we had some changes, and Dr. Elzy-Palmer has been nominated for a faculty award. That's amazing. She's deserving. I love that. So she's going to go to that, and you're going to get to hear me live talking in my office here in my podcast kind of studio. I am also the host of the School Rules podcast, which is a podcast that focuses on educational stuff, basically. And the way it came about was during COVID, as a lot of these things happen. What I started doing was just getting behind a microphone, and I was one of those kids that when I was growing up, I always wanted to be on the radio. And while the radio is kind of a dying format, I guess, the new radio is podcasting. So when I was a kid, I used to have a record player, and you can Google what a record is later if you want. And I would take the records, they were my mom's records, and I'd put them on the record player, and I'd pretend to be a DJ, and I'd talk up the record. I'd practice hitting the post, which is where you say all the things that you want to say, the weather and all your news announcements before the singer starts singing. That's called hitting the post. And I used to do that because I thought I'd be on the radio. And I feel like I have the personality for it, and so I just wanted to be on the radio. But I didn't go that route. I became a teacher. I don't know why I didn't go the radio route. And that's now that I'm rethinking my life, is that why didn't you do that? If you always wanted to do that, why didn't you pursue that dream? Well, now I guess I kind of get to do it. I get to stare at a camera, and I get to talk into a microphone, and I'm probably not doing any of this right, to be honest with you. The way my podcast works is I talk about education topics, but I also lecture. So what I do is I take all the lectures for all of my classes, whether it's my doctoral courses or my graduate courses in principalship, because I teach those courses in ed leadership. What I do is I take all the lectures for that week, no matter the class, and I throw it into a podcast. And so all of my classes listen to everything. And I just tell them, look, if it doesn't apply to you, you're not interested in the topic, because you can kind of tell what falls into the class and what doesn't, then fast forward. That's the wonder of the internet and using a laptop or your tablet or your phone. You can just fast forward and scrub your way through it. So I've been working on that. I've actually been collecting some data on it. I just wrote a paper about using podcasting as a pedagogy, and my students seem to love it. So if you like my format and like the way I just kind of vamp and talk to the camera and have a lot to say, then please like and subscribe to the School Rules podcast, wherever you get your podcast, also available on YouTube and Spotify. So what I was asked to do was just talk a little bit about my work in education. And I've been in education for 25 years, going on 26. So all in the public area, and talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done behind the scenes, because not only have I been a teacher, an assistant principal, director, assistant dean, and now assistant professor, I've done all of that work. I've also done some work behind the scenes, working to be an advocate for public education. I'm a staunch supporter of the work that we do in public education. Also working to just get the news about education correct, and what we do in this world. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So I got a list of things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to set this up as like a special podcast. That's kind of what this is. So I'm going to kind of do the episodes within the giant episode. And we're going to talk about policy work in education. We're going to talk about advocacy. I also want to talk about voting and how important it is to vote. And then lastly, just kind of throw in some information about how it will impact us if the Department of Education is closed. It's already kind of being dismantled, so what will that look like for education? So we're going to break all that down. All right, the first thing I want to talk about is policy work in education. And frankly, this is how democracy is supposed to work. So I'm going to get into a lot of how what we do in higher ed is supposed to aid society in a sense, and what we do is supposed to aid politicians. I'm going to get into all of that, but I'm not going to get political. I don't care where you stand politically. Republican, Democrat, independent, non-voter, makes no difference to me. So I'm not going to talk about what one party's doing versus another party and how this party is wrong and this party is right. I'm not going to do any of that. Now, anything I say today is going to be completely and totally neutral and just facts, because as an educator, and that's kind of where my stance is going these days with my podcast, is that we kind of need to take back the narrative on what's right and what's wrong, because unfortunately, because of social media, there's so much information out there that's just wrong. It's just incorrect. But because of the nature of things being shared and liked and going viral, etc., next thing you know, that misinformation and that bad information is getting into the wrong hands and people start to believe it. You see that a lot with medical advice these days. You're seeing it a lot with the narrative of what's happening in public schools. And so I'm going to get into all of that here in a moment. But let's talk about a little bit how policy is supposed to work. So what is policy? Well, policy is just kind of the way we do things. It's not law necessarily. Now, policy can enhance law or influence law, but it's not law. Policy is just sort of like, hey, what's our stance on this? How do we engage in these conversations? How do we support this particular area, whatever it is. So policy just sort of informs the way we're going to do whatever it is that we're going to do. So when you take a policy on something or you write a policy, the idea is to read it and it gives you a list of standards, protocols, information that allows you to make an informed decision about whatever you're trying to do. Simply put, policy should come from experts. It should come from individuals who have studied the topic, have a lot of experience in the topic, and understand how changes in law or procedure might impact the group as a whole. So let's just take education. So as someone who's been in educational leadership, as someone who's been in schools, and I understand how schools work, I should help support the government and our legislatures write laws that are going to impact public schools. So when some random legislator decides that they want to change the way a school does something, they shouldn't just arbitrarily write a law to do it. They actually should reach out to individuals who work in that area and go say, hey, I'm hearing from my constituents over here that we need to change this area of schools. What would that do if we change it? And the people who are experts should inform that politician, well, if you change it, it could do this, it could do that, it could cause this, it could create that. And sometimes it's not always bad. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes these are good changes. This is good information. So the legislator then asks, so what is the policy on blank, whatever it is they're trying to do? And the experts should then inform and aid that policy. It's a reciprocal relationship. That's the way it works. That's why we have higher education. That's why we have public schools. It's the idea is that we are the focal point of creating the research and establishing what protocols and policies and procedures should be put in place for what we are doing and researching and supporting. That's why anytime that there's new information that comes out of our research and the work that we do, we publish it. We go to conferences. We declare it publicly, the work that we have done. It is backed up by science. It is backed up by data. It is backed up by statistics. That should be the information that we then says, we should change this policy because new information tells us blah, blah, blah. And that's how the legal system should adapt and adjust. Now, my point in saying all of that is it's very important for you to know that those wheels turn very, very slowly, extremely slow. Anytime I'm working on a research project, whatever it is that I'm doing, oftentimes might take a year easily. Write the IRB, get the literature review done, collect the data, do the research, process and analyze the data, write the paper, go to a conference and present it. It could take a year, maybe longer. So you can see how oftentimes, particularly with certain areas, technology is one of them, that information moves so much faster than governments can keep up with it. So what you'll often see is knee-jerk reactions to the information that they're being given in real time, and there hasn't been any opportunities for higher education professionals and et cetera, even in the industry too, there's experts there too, to aid and inform and enhance the policy to create change. So that's one problem with policy. So particularly policy in education, though, is, if anything, we have a mountain of evidence that shows what works in education. We have a mountain of evidence that shows what works with growing teachers, supporting students, particularly our high-need students, and in my area, supporting the leadership aspect of growing schools and principals. So from the inside, what happens is that we see legislators who, the first thing they want to do is they want to cut funding. They want to take funding away from public schools because they say that we're overfunded, or we're not good stewards of the money that we're given, or we're not investing the money in the areas that they would like us to see. Or, and this happens a lot, particularly in the state of Texas, they will push down upon schools what we call unfunded mandates. Like, for example, they might say, and this just happened a couple of years ago, in the light of all the school shootings that were happening, we need more security on campus. We're going to require that every school across the state hire a full-time security guard on their campus or have some sort of law enforcement. Well, that sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? Like full-time protection for all of our students, 100%. Your first question that should cross your mind right now is, who's going to pay for that? So if you pass a law that you require it, are you going to give the funds that are necessary to hire a person to be a full-time security at a school out of all the schools that are in the state of Texas? And there are 1,250 school districts, not counting charter schools, across the state of Texas. So where does that money come from? Well, the state didn't give enough money for it, and they expected the school district to fund the rest. So you can see how those problems happen. And laws like that were passed without even asking superintendents and school district professionals, how would this impact you? What's this going to cost? What's going to be the impact? And so on. Because on the outside, it's like, well, we got to have full-time security, and now the school districts won't pay for it. So you can see how the narrative begins to spin, begins to roll. But that's a really good example of how policy should inform legislative progress. And so this happens all the time. So in the work in education, what we need to do is recapture that narrative. Because what I say all the time is that if we're not owning the narrative and what's happening in public schools and what's happening in the world, someone else is going to own that narrative, and they're going to start saying some things that are maybe half-truths or not complete, or actually just misinformation and just bad narratives. And if that happens, next thing you know, the public begins to own that truth, even though it is false. And then it takes someone like me, who's been in education a long time, to have to get in front of a camera and go, you know what, that's actually not true, and let me tell you why. And now you're working from behind. So policy, it should be a great thing, should be aided by research, should be aided by information, and it should change. It should change as you get new information. And that's kind of how I operate too. One of my other mantras is, as I get new information, I reserve the right to change my opinion. And opinions, even though you don't see this online very often, really should be based on some sort of fact. That's my overview of policy and education. I'm sure you've gone much further in talking about policy and leadership and so forth. But let's get into next how to be a really good advocate for whatever it is that you want to advocate for. And I will talk about specifically my advocacy work in education. So let's get into that. So I want to tell a quick story. When I was a principal a long time ago, back around 2010, 2009, 2010, I was a relatively new principal. I'd actually been a principal about a year at this time, so I kind of knew what I was doing. But it's summertime, and I'm working, trying to get things ready. Teachers are coming back to work and all those kind of things that you do to prep for a new school year. And my school secretary came into my office. She's like, I just had my fifth parent come in and withdraw their child. She goes, what's going on? And I said, I don't know, what's going on? And after doing some asking around and some investigating, I found out that a brand new charter school had opened up around the corner. And what that charter school was doing was advertising, which is something that public schools kind of don't do. We've never really had to advertise before. People just know that public schools are in their communities, their foundations, and of the community, and students have to go there. There's never been a time where there's been competition for public schools outside of private, and even then, private schools you have to pay for them, and sometimes they're unattainable for some people in some social classes. But I digress. So this new charter school opened up down the street. They were advertising by sending out postcards to members of the people in my community. So I got my hands on one of those postcards, and it very simply said, open enrollment, free transportation, computer-based schools, free student lunch. Okay. I offer all those things too. There's a bus that runs to my campus. We have free and reduced lunch for our students, and we have computers too. We actually had iPads. It was a brand new thing for us. So what made this charter school so unique? Absolutely nothing. Only that their advertising and campaign was better than mine. And it was pulling away students from my school and my community. This was also happening at a time where the country had just came out of a recession. There had been major funding cuts to education across the board, about $5.4 billion in cuts, which was huge. And the school district that I worked in at the time was seeing probably around $27 million in cuts, which is a lot. Had to cut a lot of people. We were cutting copiers, janitors. We were eliminating certain programs. We were combining teachers. We were getting rid of GT programs. It was rough. So being a relatively new principal, my teachers were just understandably coming to me and asking me questions. Why is this happening? Why are we doing this? Because frankly, gotta be honest, a lot of people aren't engaged politically. They're just not. They don't pay attention to what happens in their local, mayor race and school board race and what happens in their city council. Like, I would challenge all of you right now, when does your city council meet and what was the last big vote that they had on something in your community? And I guarantee you probably don't know. You know why you don't know? Because I don't know. I have no idea. And I tell you why. Because generally things kind of work. They kind of work like they're supposed to until they don't. And you're seeing that now nationally, and you might be seeing that on a state level as well in Austin. When things suddenly don't work like you think they should, and things are a little askew and don't quite make sense, or a decision has been made that's kind of out of left field and sounds a little weird to you, that's when people start paying a little more attention to what's happening. And that's when advocacy work starts to kick in. So back to my story, that's when I started really starting to advocate and sort of answering these general questions that I was getting from teachers and other people about at least school funding and school finance and what was happening in public education. So back then, 2010, 2011, with my wife, we started a blog. And that's what we did. There was no podcasting at the time, or at least podcasting was really, really primitive and brand new, and I wasn't getting into it. But blogging was still a thing. And so we wrote a blog. My wife was the writer. I was the content creator. And our blog was hugely successful. And we were doing exactly that. We were trying to let people know that we have a problem in public education in the state of Texas, and we've got to do something to fix it. We were trying to change that narrative. We were trying to create policy. We were trying to let people know that these cuts, yes, there's a revenue problem in the state of Texas, which actually there wasn't. I don't want to get into that. But the point is that our schools were suffering, and I was trying to get that information out to people and answered questions about the complicated system of school funding that's kind of crazy in this state. So I went on speaking tours. I got involved with some organizations. I got involved with certain lawmakers. I began to sort of talk to them and aid policy and help them support their campaigns to go, look, if you say you support public education, these are the things that you need to be saying and doing in order to get your message across. So between the blog and working with politicians and being involved with some of these organizations, and because Texas was sort of ground zero for all of the mess in public education, this documentary director reached out to us and followed us around for a couple of weeks as we were going to protest in Austin, and we were talking about public education and telling this story. So we were a part of a movie called The Texas Promise. It came out around 2011. You can find it online somewhere if you care that much to watch it and see what was happening about 15 years ago. But that is advocacy in a nutshell. And it's very simply put, it's telling your story. It's getting the right information out to people so that when someone asks a question and says, hey, what is blah, 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 you have an answer and you can speak to it. And you can share that information out with the right people in the community. And again, going back to what I said earlier, owning the information, owning the narrative. If you don't own that narrative, someone else is going to own it. And then the wrong information is going to get out. And I think educators have a responsibility. We have a responsibility. We are teachers. We have a responsibility to teach. So I think we should be out there doing that. Get the right information out. And when you hear something that's blatantly wrong, correct it. Just simply correct it. So it's getting that information out to the right people, the right information, and education works the exact same way. If I were to say that funding cuts to education are going to impact my school in this particular way, I own that information. I know firsthand. I've been there. I'm in the trenches. I've researched it. I understand it. I was a principal. These are the individuals that should be help dictating policy and procedure and help aiding legislation, not people who've never been there, don't understand it, and have never worked in that industry at all. So being an advocate really is about taking a stand. It's if you stand on an issue and you have a passion for it, being an advocate is just simply being a supporter of that. So for me, particularly when it comes to voting, and we'll talk more about voting in the next segment, but I'm a single issue voter. I vote for people who are intently focused on education, understand what education is, and also understand and appreciate its impact to our community. And I still work when I try to help people understand the work that happens not only in higher ed but also in K-12 because it's important. It's absolutely important. And all of us have been impacted by a public school teacher in some form or fashion. And that impact, you can't put a dollar amount on that. It's just way too important. And particularly in the state of Texas, we educate the second most number of public school students in the country, first or second, I can't remember which, but it's a lot. And because of that impact, I think it's important that we have the right policy and procedures in place in order to make sure that our public school students are successful because they deserve nothing less than that. That's what being an advocate is. It's simply being a supporter. It's in telling the story, owning the narrative, correcting misinformation, encouraging people to vote, particularly for candidates that support your issue, whatever that issue is. For me, it's education. For you, it could be something else. And getting the right information out into the public so that they can be informed about the decisions that they make. I think the problem with advocacy today is that so much of that right information, that reporting, that journalism, that truth is behind a paywall these days. And people don't read newspapers, but the work that our journalists do for the major newspapers of the world is so important. And that's what keeps governments in check. It's what keeps higher ed in check. It's what keeps corporations in check. So, that there's a microscope on you, then making sure that you're doing the job you're supposed to be doing. That's the information that needs to get out in front of people, not just, blogs, YouTube, podcasters, and so on. That's free and accessible to everyone. We need to get the right information out to the right people. And the way we do that is we advocate. Next, let's talk about voting, how important voting really is, and how impactful voting can be to changing that narrative and getting the right policy in place to impact the issues that you care about. All right, let's talk about voting. And this would be the point in our conversation if we were live in class that I would ask everyone, hey, who voted in the last election? And I would wonder how many of you have actually voted. Because young people don't vote. They just don't. They absolutely do not vote. In fact, a lot of people don't vote. It's pretty low. Now, it may seem like a lot, especially if you're looking at the national level and you're looking at national politics, and especially the last few years. And, yes, more people voted in the last two elections than ever before. Sure, those are great numbers. But, man, do you have any idea how many registered and unregistered voters didn't vote in those elections? Because voting is a choice in our country. You have a right to vote, and you have a right not to vote. You don't have to. There are some countries in this world where voting is compulsory, where it's required, where you actually have to show up and vote, or there are some sort of penalties. I think Australia is one of those countries, or at least it used to be. How interesting would that be, where you were actually required to go and cast a vote because that's how the country is counting their census, or that's how the country is going to fund countries or fund certain programs based upon how many people show up to the poll, because they value voting that much. They want your input. They want that information. Politics in America is set up in such a way that both parties would prefer you not show up, because then the statistics are in their favor. And by not showing up to vote, and they can target the people who will show up and vote, and that's where they'll spend the bulk of their money, the bulk of their campaigning, and that's how districts are drawn too. The districts are drawn and redrawn every 10 years whenever a new census comes out, and I'm sure you've heard the term gerrymandering. And if you look at the way not school districts, but voting districts are drawn in the state of Texas, you'll see that they're drawn kind of weird because they want to capture in the districts the people that they know will go out and vote. Now, who are those people? Well, I've already said they're generally not young people. Young people between the ages of 18 and 26 generally don't vote. You're busy. You're in college. You have other interests. You just aren't necessarily interested in what's happening on a national scale. I'm not going to say that's done by design, but it's just it's a lack of engagement of what it is. It's just kind of part of it. It's been that way for a long time. So folks who are young don't vote. 26 to 35, a little bit more engagement, but not as much. The primary group of voters kind of falls in the 35 to 50, and then the 50 plus category. Those are the folks that vote. So if you know that information and you know how to concentrate your campaign dollars and the information to tailor it to those individuals, and if you've watched enough ads on TV, you can kind of tell what's the message they're trying to convey. So that's voting. Now, I'm going to blow your mind here for a minute, because you might think that voting and elections are primarily determined around November, when everybody goes out to vote, whether it's for Senate or House or some of the local races or even president. I'm going to tell you that that's not where these things are decided. These things are actually decided most of the time in May. And they are decided at the primary election level. Now, primary elections. Now, what's a primary election? Well, the primary elections is basically what happens around May, where the candidates for whatever particular office for both parties all come together, and you get to go and decide which candidate is going to be represented on the ballot later that year. So one party is going to run 4 or 5 people. The other party is going to run 4 or 5 people. And then you actually have to go to the polls and you have to select which party you want to vote for. So if you say, I'm going to vote for the Republican Party, then you enter that booth and all you're voting on are the potential Republicans that may be on the ballot in the fall. Or you walk into the ballot office or the ballot location and you say, I'm going to vote Democrat. And you go to and you get a Democrat ballot, and it's all the Democrat voters, candidates that are going to be on the ballot in November. And it's majority rules. So whoever wins the primary then goes on to the finals in November for that office. Decisions about who's going to win that seat, 95% of the time, I'm not making that number up, are decided at the primary level. And let me just tell you, you probably have already figured this out, which time of year are there the least amount of voters? It's in the primaries. People don't vote in May. They just don't. There's a very low turnout. It is a less than 3% voter turnout for primary elections. So just imagine for a moment that a lot of the people that are down in Austin at the state legislature, a lot of the people that are in Washington, D.C., and a lot of judge positions and county positions, they got to their seat largely because 3% of the population, of the voting population, selected them in May. Because the districts are drawn in such a way that it skews for one party versus another. So then by the time they get to the ballot in November, all right, people who show up in November largely vote via party affiliation. And if you're a Republican, you're going to vote for the Republicans. If you're a Democrat, you're going to vote for the Democrats. And depending on the district that you're in, it's going to lean heavy one way or the other. And that's why voting in primary elections are so important. Let me just back this up with a quick story. I mentioned in the advocacy work that I was doing, one of the things I did, I ran for school board at my local school for the school district that I live in. I ran for the school board. I lost by 30 votes. 30. I lost by 30 votes. I haven't lived that down. I didn't run a great campaign. I mean, I didn't run this broad campaign. I ran a Facebook campaign. I had a few signs, and I just worked to get my name out there in the community and people that I knew, and I lost by 30 votes because less than 2% of people vote in school board elections. In the entire school district that has a voting eligibility, only 2,000 people showed up to vote. 2,000. 2,000 out of a potential like 40,000 people. And that's just for a school board race. Imagine something larger than that. So voting engagement, that's why you see it so often. It's so important to get out and vote, get out and vote, get out and vote. You hear it all the time. Get registered, get out and vote, get registered, get out and vote. But where we need you voting is in primary election. That's where your opinion matters the most. And going back to everything I've said, policy and advocacy, paying attention to what those politicians are saying about the issues that you care about should drive your decision. And you should be able to walk into a primary election ballot location and say, you know what, I'm going to select this party, not because I'm affiliated with that party, but because I want to make sure I have the right people in the seat that I want to win the election. So yeah, it takes a little bit of work and time on your part. So you might have to go into the party affiliation that you generally don't vote for, and you're going to have to select the person you think is least likely to win the election. That's kind of how these things work these days. And it really is about selecting the individual that's best suited for the seat, but also the individual that's best suited for the policies and issues that you care about. Being a voter, absolutely important. Voting in as many of the elections that you possibly can, super, super important, particularly in the primary elections that happen in May. And look, I know it's kind of a pain. You got to get up, you got to go, you got to wait in line, you got to cast your ballot. You know, it takes a little bit of time out of your day. But I would argue that outside of needing an ID to vote, it's still very convenient. There's a lot of voting access that has improved over the years. And yeah, we haven't got to a point where we can vote online, but I don't think we should be at that point yet. That's a whole nother discussion. But my point is, voting is important. And otherwise, you're going to find yourself constantly in advocacy mode, constantly talking about, here's what we need, here's how we need to support our issue, here's how we need to support change if we're not getting out and vote. I would encourage you, if you haven't been a voter, be one. Be engaged. Be part of it. If you have family members who are not engaged, be an advocate for them to be engaged. You don't always have to agree, but have the conversation at least. Hey, we need your vote. We need your support in whatever issue that you care the most about. So, but most importantly, vote in the primary elections, because that's where the most important piece of voting is absolutely needed in our country. We need more people voting in primary elections. Otherwise, we're going to keep getting politicians in place that have been selected by 3% of the population, and that's just not good for democracy. So get out and vote, get registered, do it today. Okay, so you've heard me talk about policy work in education. You've heard me talk about advocacy. And we've talked a little bit about voting and why it's so important to vote. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is it's crazy that this is being discussed and actually happening before our eyes, but the closing or the dismantling of the Department of Education. So I've already done a little bit of work on this, talked about this in the podcast, but I want to kind of reiterate again, how did this happen? How did we get to this point? What would be the impact? So I want to share a little bit of information about why we're even having this discussion about closing the Department of Ed. Now, before we get started, I think it's important to note that since about 2015 and even more so since COVID, there's been this recent trend, particularly from people on the internet and social media, and even more so from podcasters and even into our legislatures, whether it's national or state, this kind of growing distrust for what experts are doing, growing distrust for what's happening in our public entities, not in schools, county governments, city governments. I think a lot of it stemmed from COVID-19, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, those kinds of things that were happening where government officials, elected officials, were making decisions that people on a large scale didn't agree with, didn't like, didn't want, however you want to put it. And so ever since then, it's created this, again, distrust. And I've seen it a lot in education, and maybe you have too, discussions about critical race theory and how critical race theory is being taught in our schools. It's not being taught in our schools, but there was a belief that it was. So you saw school board, local school boards, people showing up just crazy and enraged because they were reacting to what they were hearing and seeing from other external outlets, social media, news outlets, blogs, podcasts, whatever. They were reacting to that versus actually going to an expert and saying, hey, is this happening? But instead of doing that, it was an immediate distrust of the expert or the people in charge, the elected officials, the superintendent, the directors of whatever agency. So this reactionary system started to happen and manifest itself, particularly since COVID. And ever since then, there's been a growing distrust of public agencies. And public schools are not immune to that. But this discussion about closing the Department of Education is not a new discussion. It's been around for a while, and it's been a talking point of a lot of politicians for the last several years. Now, I don't know that there's ever been a good reason that's been expressed. Like, why are we closing the Department of Education? Is it doing something wrong? Is it doing something ineffective? Is it doing something inefficient? You don't normally hear those things. You just hear them say it's a waste of money, and it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. Or you might hear them say they're indoctrinating curriculum, they're indoctrinating our students with DEI, and we're going to take funding away because they're indoctrinating our students, and that's not happening either. So I want to talk a little bit about what is the Department of Education, what's the work that it actually does. It's one of the newest cabinet spots, been around since 1979, so that may not seem like it's new. It's almost 50 years old, but compared to other cabinet positions, it's very, very new. And why did we need it, and what has it been doing, and what will be the impact of closing it? So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, before I could talk more about the Department of Education, let me give you a little bit of history, just a brief bit of history. In the 1970s and early 1980s. So in the 1970s, early 1970s, there was a lot of changes in the United States, a lot of changes for certain civil rights groups in this country. There was the growth of feminism, changes in civil rights laws, disability laws, supporting women in athletics. Title IX was invented. There were ADA laws written. 504 came out of that, which is for students who have disabilities. Special ed laws were written. So in the 1970s, there was this era of really starting to change the way that we support and interact with people who have special needs or people that have been largely marginalized for a very long time. So because of that had a great impact on our public schools. Again, now we've got to change a lot of things. The way things that we have been doing things have got to change. and change for the better, and that's great. And so it takes time for schools to adapt and to adjust and get the funding in place. But all of those are federal laws. All of those are laws that are in place to help support those individual groups to make sure that they have access to public education. Fast forward a little bit to 1983, and 1983 is a pivotal year. Maybe 82. Now I'm thinking about it, but it's 82 or 83. And this report came out, produced by the Reagan administration. It was called "A Nation at Risk." It was a pretty difficult read. This Nation at Risk report basically talked about how public education in the country is struggling in a lot of ways, but most importantly, from a competitive standpoint, our country's status in the rest of the world, we were behind. We were behind the rest of the world in a lot of key areas: literacy, math, science, tuition attainment, reaching college education, being able to attain higher education. And our schools and our students were really struggling. And that Nation at Risk report was a monumental, pivotal report to help press forth, again, a lot of policy changes and legal changes to the way that we do public schools across the country. And Texas, where we live, was not immune to that either. Some of the largest reforms that we've had in public education came as a result of that report, and we started doing things a lot differently, and all for the better. Standards changed, teacher certification changed, the curriculum changed, the way we fund schools changed. So much changed for the better to help improve our standing, not only in the state, but in the world. I give you that background because when it comes to reform and change and new laws, most importantly, and this is how government is supposed to work, you have to have someone to oversee that, to make sure that people are actually doing what they're required to do. Legally, procedurally, policy-wise, you've got to have oversight, and that's largely what government does. It's okay, we have a law in place. How do we make sure that people actually do what they're supposed to do? Because believe it or not everybody does what they're supposed to do for whatever reason. Maybe they're bad people. Maybe they don't spend the money where they want to spend it. Maybe they just simply ignore it, whatever. Believe it or not, we actually have to make sure that people are compliant. And so that's part of the government's work, is to ensure compliance, to make sure that we are all doing what we're supposed to be doing. And you know what? 98% of the time, people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. They really are. There are so many protocols and procedures in place, even on higher ed, that we got to make sure that we're doing to prove that, hey, yeah, we're actually following the law. We're following what you tell us to do. If we don't, then we lose the ability to teach or certify or a variety of things. So I won't get into all that. But the Department of Education, one of its key functions is that oversight, particularly for students who have disabilities or students that are in special education, because IDEA, which is the special education law, and the Americans with Disability Act has the 504 clause, which says that if you have a disability in a school, we have to have an accommodations plan for you. So in our schools, we are held to federal standards. And now the state is the one that has to step in and make sure that schools are doing this appropriately. But one of the key functions of the Department of Education is national oversight to make sure that school districts across the country are actually supporting special education students, supporting students that have disabilities, and making sure that that funding and that information is getting out to parents, and that schools have processes and procedures in place to help educate those individual students. Now, if you eliminate or dismantle the Department of Education, those laws aren't going away. You still have to educate students that have disabilities and special education students. They're legally required to do that. But what's going to happen is that we're going to have some that reduced oversight and support and legal compliance to help make sure that our students with disabilities are being served. So one of the biggest concerns that I think educators have about dismantling or closing the Department of Education is that legal oversight. We don't want our students that have special needs being lost in the shuffle. We want to make sure that everybody's still doing the right thing And I believe educators will continue to do that. But with a lack of oversight, there might be some of our most marginalized and students with the highest needs not getting the support that they need in our public schools without that appropriate legal oversight. The next thing the Department of Education does, and this is kind of a big one, is funding. There is some federal funding that comes down to public schools. Now, largely, I want to make this clear to everybody since I'm a big advocate of getting the right information out there. Public schools are largely funded by state and local sources. Now, when I talk about the state of Texas, it's kind of a 50-50 split, not quite that. It's a little bit more local than it is state. But public schools do receive some federal funding. It's about 9 or 10% of the total overall budget. It's not a lot, but it's enough to make a difference. Now, there are a lot of titles. You probably know Title IX, and you probably heard of Title I, but believe it or not, there's Titles 2 through 8 in between there too, and they all stand for something, they all mean something, and I won't get into what all of them mean. But some of it is to support bilingual students, professional development for teachers, improving curriculum, and Title I, which is to help our economically disadvantaged students in some of our most highest need public schools. And so what the federal government does is they provide literally a grant. It's a grant. It's not funding. It's a grant that school districts actually have to apply for on a regular basis, an annual basis, to make sure that they get that funding every year. And it's based upon a percentage of economically disadvantaged students that they have in their district. Then that money is disseminated where it is most needed. So you've probably heard the term Title I school. Well, a Title I school is a school that has an economically disadvantaged population of 60% or more. So with that, that's where that funding comes from, and the Department of Education is responsible for disseminating that funding. Now, it's been said that that funding won't go away. It'll just fall under another department. I think they said the Department of Treasury. Okay, that's fine, but now you have a Treasury Department that lacks educators, people that work in the education industry that know how these things work, and now they're responsible for Title I. So you can see that there might be some delays, maybe some disinterest, maybe it falls through the cracks. I don't know, because those policies and procedures are not going to fall under another department to help support our schools. So it might take some time for people to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? Because now it's a new thing and creating another department. But we also run the risk of losing it too because of all the cuts that are happening across the federal government right now anyway. So that's a big one. All of the titles, Title I through IX, and the funds that are tied to it, and the oversight that's tied to it, since we've already talked a little bit about that. So that's another impact of closing the DOE. Another area of support is in higher education. And if you haven't noticed, and I'm sure that you've talked about this in your class a little bit, is that there are a lot of higher education institutions across the country rely on federal grants in order to conduct research and have certain programs on campus and so on and so on. There's a lot of federal funding that supports colleges, universities across the country. And so that money is being cut. A lot of it comes out of the Department of Education, not all of it, but some of it, a good portion of it. There are other agencies that also issue federal grants for research and other things as well. But the Department of Education also manages federal student loans, federal grants, the Pell Grant, student aid for students on campus. That's already a complicated mess if you're a student who's been through the financial aid process. And while it's been retooled and retrained, again, if it falls under another department, that's fine. At least it won't go away. But again, you don't have educators who've been doing this for a long time, who understand how to do it, knows how it operates and how it works. You've got someone else now doing that. That can cause delays, confusion, and just that lack of support that's needed for people who are trying to go to school, trying to get grants, trying to go to college, or for colleges and universities that are trying to grow certain programs, support certain agencies that they've built on campus, and so on. So that's another major impact. The work that the DOE does is to help support some of our college students, and that's going to hurt. All right, last but not least, and this has been the argument I've heard largely for closing the Department of Education, is that much of what the Department of Education does will now be shifted to state and local control. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that because, again, I think it's important to put the right information out there, that in no way, shape, or form has the Department of Education dictated curriculum to our school districts. It just doesn't happen. Now, years ago, when we shifted to Common Core, the Department of Education was responsible for some of the professional development leading to that, but the DOE didn't write the Common Core standards, and Common Core standards are not in Texas. They never have been. Now, there was some money tied to Common Core where states who adopted those Common Core standards would get some money to help support implementing those standards because it's expensive to do that. But that was it. That's the only money that tied to it. And the DOE doesn't tell school districts what to teach. They don't tell the state what to teach. That's not what the DOE does. They help support what you're currently doing. They help answer questions. They collect data and they let you know, hey, what you're doing, is it working? Is it not working? So they become a big data agency and a research organization and a support system, professional development to support teachers, to support principals. They do that kind of work. Now, so the advocates for closing the DOE have said, well, now we need to shift all that back to the states. Okay, that's fine if you want to do that. But again, that work, that need, it doesn't go away. And not all state education agencies are equipped to manage that level of research, professional development, curricular support. They're just not able to do that. So that's going to, again, cause some confusion, cause some delays whenever that support is needed, because that is a real important area that school districts really rely on. Outside of that, I don't think this is an area that can just shift to another department. This is led by educators. The data is collected by educators. And there are a lot of professors, particularly in my area of education, that rely on that research and that data to continue the work that they're doing. And I'm not sure where that data is going to go, if it gets housed somewhere else, if it's going to even be accessible anymore. Some of those questions haven't been answered yet. But this concept of we need to return public schools back to local control, that's just a false narrative. Public schools are already under local control. You have a locally elected school board that hires and fires a superintendent, that writes local policy, follows state law and procedure. In Texas, we have a state curriculum. It's called the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. Those are the standards. Now, you can write curriculum off of those standards, but that's what we are legally obligated and required to teach in the state of Texas. We don't get our standards or our curriculum from the Department of Education. That's just, frankly, false. It's not true. So we already have local control. We already have state control of our public schools. All the DOE does is just support the work that we're already doing. So if that's eliminated, then that support goes away and the states are going to have to pick up the slack. Plain and simple. Well, that's it. I really appreciate and am honored to have been part of your class. I'm sorry this couldn't have been a live engagement where you could ask me questions, but you're certainly welcome to email me, jburkett1@twu.edu. Happy to answer any questions. Like and subscribe my podcast if you like my flow, like the conversation that we have. I try to keep it light, try to keep it fun, try to keep it interesting because this is just sort of the style of lecture that I use. But I appreciate Dr. Elzy-Palmer for inviting me to be part of this class. I hope that I could be a part of a future class if you'll have me. But otherwise, as I always say, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.